So today's topic, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about, is called Doing With and Not To, Working in Partnership with Families Undergoing Assessment. And our speaker is Teigan, who is one of our Frontline Programme Fellows. Teigan completed our programme in 2022. We were just talking actually that her cohort was the first cohort we delivered all online to as a result of COVID. So Teigan remembers that switch up quite quickly. But Teigan currently works for a local authority in London. So I'm going to hand over to Teigan now to talk you through her presentation.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm Teigan, and today I'll be speaking about my research project, which looked at working in partnership with families who are undergoing assessment. So just for a bit of context, I did my ASYE in a special guardianship team. So my role was largely conducting court-ordered assessments of people who wanted to be the special guardian of a known child who could no longer live with their parents. So essentially, I was assessing whether they were able to meet the child's needs and then making a recommendation to the court about whether they should grant this person parental responsibility. And in my role, I noticed that I was taking a bit more of a directive approach to these assessments. And by taking the position of expert observer, I was inadvertently pushing the applicants, the family members, into the role of subject of the assessment. And that was really reinforcing the power dynamics or the power imbalances that we talk about between social workers and families. So I decided to focus my project on working in partnership with families to try and combat this. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought I should clarify what exactly I mean by partnership. And I will make reference to a number of terms like co-production, co-creation, patient and public involvement, social innovation. There's a kind of whole range of things which do have subtle differences or are used in different contexts, but ultimately they have these kind of underlying unifying features, which are doing with families rather than doing to families. So having families as active participants rather than passive recipients of services, attempting to share power more equitably between practitioners and families, having respect for a client's expertise, so placing value on their experiences and their voices in the same way that we value the views and opinions of culturally designated like professionals or experts like social workers. And finally, attempting to actively elicit a client's particular meaning rather than assuming that we already know it or that it's the same as ours. And I think that kind of has a number of different names. So I think Anderson and Gulishin call it a position of not knowing. Madsen calls it listening on client turf. It's kind of similar to cultural curiosity, but this kind of idea of actually kind of seeing the world through the family's eyes rather than through ours. And when I was doing my literature review, I was really struck by this quote. So this was by Susan Hunter, who looked at co-production in a number of different contexts, and she concluded that common to all of these contexts was this: an uneasy relationship with the mainstream, dancing the thin line between incorporation and marginalization, becoming diluted and being too hard to swallow. And I think it resonated because it's something that we see a lot in children's social care. So, for example, a lot of the families that we work with don't necessarily have the procedural knowledge or even the literacy skills sometimes to challenge oppression or poor treatment in ways that are considered acceptable by the local authority, like going through a really bureaucratic complaints process. But if parents are too loud or too assertive in the way that they stand up for themselves, they're given a label of disruptive, and then that's used to silence them. So they might be asked to leave a meeting. So they face the choice between becoming diluted by sitting quietly and tolerating other people saying things that they don't feel reflects the truth, or becoming too hard to swallow and facing the consequences. And I also think it resonated with me on a personal level because when I was doing this project, I'd recently been diagnosed with autism, and neurotypical people tend to find autistic people too hard to swallow. And so autistic people, myself included, learn to mask by suppressing certain behaviours and traits to fit in. So while I was undertaking the research, I was also going through a journey of learning to unmask. And it came with challenges in my personal and my professional life. So, for example, being autistic, I tend to be quite outspoken and quite direct. And that has its advantages. You know, when you're advocating for a family or challenging decisions that you don't think are in the child's best interest, that can be great. But if I'm being too blunt or too direct to someone who's like above me in the hierarchy, like a manager or an IRO, that's perceived as rude. And I think my managers kind of started to see me as being a bit of a liability in that respect. So I was also learning how to walk this line between being diluted by continuing to mask and being authentically myself, but risking being too hard to swallow. So if we look at what that looks like in terms of working in partnership, William Madsen suggests that when client experience is organised into professional categories, it is marginalised and obscured. So I'm sure this resonates with a lot of people in the audience. Like, families' lives are colourful and multifaceted and complex. And when we try and squeeze them into these little neat boxes, we lose so much. So for my project, for special guardianship assessments, we use a template which sets out what kind of topics we have to cover. And obviously, I, as a social worker, couldn't abandon that template. Like, the local authority wouldn't allow that. And fair enough, there are good reasons for using a template. But in using that template, I was diluting families' very rich life experiences and knowledge. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that there are barriers within children's social care to achieving this kind of true partnership. So, I mean, Madsen also points out that actually the assumption of professional expertise is really evident just in the way that we do assessments. So quite literally, who is asking the questions and who is deciding whether the answers are good enough. There are also tensions created by prioritising children above their parents. So the 26-week time limit of care proceedings. To be truly working in partnership with parents, we would want to take things at their pace. We would want to support them to make changes on their timeline. But actually, we also need timely outcomes for children so that they can achieve permanency. They're not left in limbo while court proceedings drag on for years. So we have this kind of time limit, and that creates a kind of tension. I mean, we do have to make decisions all the time that parents disagree with in order to safeguard children. So for me, that was giving negative assessments where I couldn't recommend to the court that they grant this family member a special guardianship order. But in making that recommendation, I was essentially saying that I knew better than the family. Even though they believed they could meet the child's needs, I disagreed. And that wasn't truly showing a respect for the family's expertise. And I don't think in that moment families would have described that experience as embodying partnership. There are loads and loads of different barriers. Some of them are really obvious like that, but some of them are quite subtle or maybe to do with the culture of the organisation. And please, in the chat, I'm sure everyone would really benefit from seeing other people's experiences, so feel free to share. But then where does this leave us anyway? If we kind of acknowledge that our acceptance of service user expertise is and probably has to be conditional and limited, does that mean we should give up? No, obviously not. So there are loads of things we can do. Again, please feel free to share them in the chat, but I'm going to zoom in a bit on some of the ones that came out of my research specifically, because I actually found some of them quite surprising. So firstly, authenticity. This is one that I really kind of hadn't expected to notice or to kind of come out of it, but Madsen, again, Madsen's name pops up a lot. Madsen suggests that when we do have to impose normative standards on families, that we should, in his words, make visible the values, thoughts and assumptions that organise our work. And again, it's alluded to a lot in the literature. So Anderson, talking from a therapy point of view, calls it being public with one's inner conversation. And I think that's what I hadn't been doing until then. So as part of my masking, I tried to shield families from my kind of chaotic way of thinking. And I spent lots of time before visits organising my thoughts and planning out the words I was going to use. And in some senses, it was good. It meant I was clear and consistent. I had clear expectations. The family was all aware of those. I didn't contradict myself, but it also left less room for partnership. So as part of my project, I tried thinking out loud a bit more. And And you can see on this diagram that there are a number of ways that led to greater feelings of partnership. So firstly, there were fewer like pre-understandings, is what Anderson calls them. So basically what I was talking about earlier about eliciting families' meanings rather than imposing our own, by kind of pre-deciding what I was going to say, I wasn't allowing room for that. So instead, rather than going into the situation having already thought about it with my own lens and using my own words, I was coming with a greater openness. And therefore, as I was forming my thoughts, the participants' ideas were merging with mine before they were ever fully formed. Additionally, I think it just made me a bit more human, rather than a robotic professional who had all of the answers. I think that made things less daunting, so participants felt more able to contribute. And I was also spending less energy on masking and on playing the role of professional, which then freed up space for me to be more present in those interactions. And maybe that's more amplified for me as an autistic social worker, but I'm sure that for a lot of students and newly qualified social workers who might be in the audience, it's probably also true. I think a lot of us spend just as much energy wondering if we're doing social work right as we do actually being present in that moment. And then finally, it allowed for greater transparency, which meant that even if a family and I were disagreeing, we were still more coordinated in our meanings. We had the same frame of reference, and that allowed for kind of things to flow a bit better. Secondly, I think it's really important to be reflexive and reflective, but especially with others. So, okay, our respect for service user expertise might need to be conditional and might need to be limited, but under what conditions should it be centred and when should it be overruled? When we're imposing normative standards, where have those standards come from? In what context were they created, and now what context are they being applied? What assumptions are we making when we're imposing them? And we can't do that kind of reflection alone. We need other people with different worldviews to kind of shine a light on our blind spot. So for me, a critical part of my dissertation was having a critical friend who was able to very kindly but quite boldly point out when I wasn't living up to my own values. And I think in kind of day-to-day social work, that can take the form of supervision with the manager, reflexive discussions with your team, and of course asking families themselves. But in terms of being reflexive, I think also there's something about being relationally reflexive. So some authors like Hunter and Cox criticise partnership and co-production as ways of shifting the burden of welfare onto families. So basically using it to kind of extract resources from them. And I mean, the way I was thinking about it is sometimes before, not necessarily in a social work context, but I've approached a friend or a manager for advice and support, and they're really empathetic, but ultimately they turn it around and say, well, what do you think we should do? And it's really well intentioned. They're trying to give me control in the situation. But often if I go to ask someone for help, it's because I'm overwhelmed and I haven't got the headspace to step back and decide what to do. So I think it can be a bit similar that, yes, it's great to collaborate with families, but we don't want to put that kind of mental load on them if they haven't got the space in that moment to kind of, for that to be helpful for them. So I think relational reflexivity can be really helpful to avoid that. We can ask what they want their role in the assessment to look like, and we can make sure they've got the headspace for certain discussions. We can ask, when I ask you questions, do you prefer specific like guiding questions, or do you find that constraining? Like we can kind of maximize our collaboration, but without overwhelming families. And then finally, flattening knowledge hierarchies. So I also would call this democratizing knowledge formation. So basically, we're encouraged in our assessments, in our court statements, to use research to strengthen our arguments. And I'm not arguing against that at all. I think it's really important that we're not just blindly doing whatever we like. But I think sometimes there's this assumption that research is the be all and end all, and if that's what the research says, it must be the right thing to do. But it ignores the fact that research is done by humans with their own values and their own biases, and despite their best intentions, it shows in the conclusions they come to. There is quite little diversity within like journal authors. Most are white, most are middle class, most are educated to at least degree level, and it can be really hard for people who aren't those things to permeate that world. Like if you have a Venn diagram of people who are published in social work journals and people who have lived experience of social care involvement, they probably wouldn't overlap a whole lot. I think families, or certainly my participants, talked about social workers kind of going by the book and using textbooks to inform their like decisions and judgments, and how that felt really oppressive. And actually, if we use textbooks that are informed by those with lived experience, and if we use sources that aren't just formal textbooks, that would make our practice quite a lot less oppressive. So I think it's really important that we make an effort to use research produced by and with those with lived experience and those working on the ground, instead of just in universities far removed from the day-to-day realities of social work. And I think the research dissertations done by frontline participants are like really key in that they kind of start to bridge this gap between theory and practice, and most importantly they use the feedback of the families, the people who really, really matter in all of this. So with that in mind, I just wanted to revisit this quote to acknowledge that for us social workers, it can take different amounts before we get to that point of being too hard to swallow. So for me, it felt like I was already rocking the boat by being my authentic autistic self. So it felt a bit more difficult to push. But other aspects of my social location, like being white and middle class and degree educated, afforded me quite a lot of privilege. So I could then push things more before I reached that threshold of being too hard to swallow. And for everyone in the audience, that will be kind of different amounts depending on who they are as a person, their identity, and how much of that identity they bring to work. That will kind of affect when they reach this threshold of other people finding them too hard to swallow. And of course, there might well be a few like students, newly qualified social worker, and again, you're being assessed, and that you feel kind of less able to push the boundaries and challenge the status quo because you're being judged. But where possible, I would really encourage people to push those boundaries by being more authentic and by amplifying the voices of families and by drawing on research that maybe hasn't been published in a prestigious journal, but actually that better reflects the experiences of families. I also should make a quick note that in this dichotomy, allowing yourself to be diluted isn't inherently bad. I think when I was actually doing this project, I had the assumption that being diluted is bad, but I have shifted on that because I think I've realized that sometimes it's necessary for survival. Like if we want to kind of carry on with our sanity intact, we do have to allow ourselves to be diluted. And also, it's not necessarily the best thing for families if we're kind of like taking up a lot of space and creating challenge that can kind of inadvertently transfer to families, and we need to make sure that we're prioritizing that. But I think my message is that I would encourage people to think about where exactly you fall on this line, and just to make sure that you're making a deliberate choice about that, so that you're doing your best for families, but in a way that's sustainable for you as a practitioner. I think that's about it from me. Does anyone have any questions? Hand back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Teigan. Really, really enjoyed listening to that, and I'll see if any questions pop up. I had a couple that I sort of wondered if you could think about and give a response to. And the first one was around that sort of critical friend. It sounds a really obvious thing, doesn't it? Like it's really good to have critical friends in social work, and you mentioned potentially you could sometimes get that from your line manager, but I guess supervision can be sort of founded on different priorities. Are you aware of any kind of networking or social work forums or buddying that happens to do that? Because wouldn't that be such a great idea?
Yeah, no, it would. I mean, off the top of my head, no. I mean, there are different ways, I'm sure. So, like, I know that BASWA has a lot of special interest groups that kind of focus on different topics, and I'm sure that could be a space for that. I don't know. I mean, in my local authority, we had like reflexive supervision, which is exactly that.
Okay.
We kind of almost stole the unit meeting model a little bit, so that everyone kind of has their views. I mean, it's a bit different if it's not one-to-one. I was really lucky in my dissertation with my critical friend because she was a carer that I was working with, but her assessment had already been completed by somebody else, and I was acting as her supervising social worker. So there wasn't that same power dynamic of, oh, I'm assessing you and therefore you have to be careful what you say to me. She was able to be quite open and honest, and she felt able to, which was amazing of her, because it must have taken quite a lot of bravery sometimes to say, actually, I'm not sure here that you're quite doing the thing that you think you're doing. You're not quite living up to your own values. So that, I'm immensely grateful to her. I'm not sure, that everybody has access to someone like that, but even using your colleagues, but colleagues who don't necessarily manage you, just like who you have that kind of close relationship. I'm afraid I don't know of any like formal kind of groups, but I guess it's about kind of finding that person for yourself and making space for those discussions, even when it's really frantic and you feel like you can't stop for breath, because that's when we kind of start to lose that reflexive side of things and we start just doing without thinking. So
definitely
more helpful.
And then the other thing I was thinking about is that balance. I found it really powerful, hearing about your journey to embracing autism, and getting that diagnosis, and how that sort of perhaps changed your planning or authenticity with families. And I guess like that balance between being swallowed versus being diluted, how you sort of tread that line, and you touched a little bit on that at sort of the end of the presentation. Are there any points where you kind of think is non-negotiable? Like you mentioned like, there are times when perhaps you have to balance it out a bit and be a bit diluted. Do you think there's any times when it's non-negotiable either way, or have you got any examples of that?
So interestingly, in my dissertation, I talked about using the source of oughtness as a bit of a heuristic for whether you need to kind of stand up to it or not. So basically, there were two things going on. So I was struggling to kind of assert to one of my applicants that the assessment was going to be negative and needed to be negative, and there was a source of oughtness, like that kind of meant that I had to say that. But there was also this kind of issue of, she had a really poor experience with the local authority. There were some factual inaccuracies in her viability assessment, and that really undermined her trust. And I was trying to kind of build that up, but I didn't feel like I could undermine the local authority by kind of almost agreeing, like, oh yes, that is, really poor that happened. And I felt, there was kind of this tension for me. And actually, the source of the oughtness in those respects was key for me knowing. So the oughtness in the giving the negative assessment came from me really having this like desire to prioritize the child's safety and well-being and, life chances almost. So that for me was a really like valid source of oughtness, and that kind of helped me to feel, yes, I need to be firm on this. And yet the source of oughtness in the other context about not wanting to undermine the local authority, that was coming from being an employee of the local authority and therefore feeling like I couldn't criticize them. And for me, that felt incompatible with being authentic, because by kind of not agreeing with her, I wasn't being authentic, because I agreed with her. That's a really horrible thing. Like, no wonder she didn't trust us anymore. And so looking at whether it was kind of the source of oughtness was compatible with me being authentic actually really helped to guide me. I don't know. I think there's a lot in trusting your gut. Like, sometimes you just know that this is really wrong. I really need to stand up to this. And sometimes it's like, should I let this go? And I think we need to listen to families in that. If they're saying, yes, please, this is really important to me, can we like advocate for this? Can we make sure this happens? Then that again is a good signal that we should go for it. But actually, if we're risking families by, you know, I don't know. So, for example, one family was a bit uncomfortable with me including all of their like childhood history within the assessment, and but if I'd kind of failed to do that, then the local authority would have regarded that with suspicion, or the court would have regarded that with suspicion, because, you know, why are they withholding that information? That's a bit suspicious. What are they not telling us? So it would have not been fair for me to pass that risk on by standing up for them and saying, no, I'm not giving you this information. I'm kind of working in partnership with them, but I'm also passing on a risk without necessarily fully explaining it. So again, I think we need to make sure that families are fully like informed, and then use their kind of judgment on whether they want something to happen or not, to then know whether to stand up, or whether to actually be diluted. And yeah
That's a really helpful explanation, certainly for me, in terms of thinking about that. And two things, I guess it highlights what a kind of complex task social work is. And I don't mean that families are complex. I mean that the thinking, the analysis, the relationship building, the assessing, like, I think we forget how social workers often do that instinctively, but it's such a complex task. It's such a skilled task is probably a better way of saying that. So it's been really nice to hear you sort of talk about that, and just, you know, how you make those decisions, where you land, how you land, why you land, and when you choose to kind of dilute versus speaking up. So yeah, really appreciate that presentation. It's really great to hear from you. There's a couple of comments in the chat for people, you may have picked them up, about different groups. There's a multidisciplinary special interest group for critical reflection, the link is in the chat, and also some parental advocacy forums and groups that might be useful for people to think about. So and final comment, difference between collusion and collaboration, which I really like. I think what I'll take away is families first, like keep them central to all that you're doing. I think that's come across really clearly.